a lot of the Bible studies and curriculum and books, it doesn't talk about it. It doesn't require it, right? It requires the person leading it just to know something rather than to be something. And, Jesus, like you said, he was the model, right? Luke 6:40, a student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. So the person discipling is the flesh and blood model. And if we're leaning too heavily on a resource, we aren't that. And we don't need to be that. But we do need to be it if we want to make reproducing disciples. And so that's the part that's so important. And a lot of these tests it encourages us to think carefully about how we're discipling and whether we're leaning too much on resources like books and curriculum and Bible studies, or whether we're actually incarnating, we're being a disciple maker, and whether we're asking and presenting a picture to those we're discipling as if, yes, this is necessary. You can't just know stuff, right? It's not enough to know stuff or attend stuff. We have to become something different.
Hey, Justin, thanks for joining us on the show today. Great opportunity to talk about our favorite subject with Into the Harvest, just like on your podcast, Practitioner's podcast, Jesus. And how do we keep our focus on Jesus and be Jesus-centered disciple makers? So today we're going to talk about a topic called how to make a disciple and what are the 7 tests that will keep us in line with a biblical view and, more importantly, to help us zone in directly on Jesus. Justin, before we jump in, I just wanted to give you an opportunity just to kind of introduce yourself to our crowd. We've known each other a little bit. Turns out that we follow some of the same teams, grew up around almost the same area of the world, which is pretty crazy. There's not a whole lot of people from where we're from. But yeah, you've been on staff for quite some time with the Navigators, a couple decades, and you've really kind of honed your craft as a disciple maker. You're a great resourcer for folks who are trying to figure out how to make disciples and make it look like Jesus. Yeah, I really want to just give you the floor, give you a chance to introduce yourself. We know each other a little bit, but most of the folks probably don't know you at all.
Yeah, thanks, John. Appreciate it. 2 Buckeyes on the podcast today. So OH, we could do that, right? We like to spell our state.
I-O. Yes, sir.
Yep. So,
yes, sir.
I've been making disciples for close to 25 years now. And done it in a lot of different contexts. And honestly, following Jesus and trying to be like him has radically changed my life since I was 20 years old. And right now I'm living in Dayton, Ohio, have 4 kids ranging in age from 8 to 14. My oldest 3 are girls, and then my 8-year-old is a son. And we transitioned, John, last year. I thought we were still in kidland, and then my daughter tells us she has a boyfriend, and we're like, no, you don't. You do not have a boyfriend.
All right, it's getting serious.
Yep, but at that age, they're at school saying whatever they're saying about each other, and it doesn't much matter what mom and dad say at home. So anyway, it was quite the year with her, but she's doing well, and the rest of our kids are doing well, but as parents, we're continuing to learn, how do we lean in? How do we model Jesus and help lead them to Jesus without forcing Jesus down their throats? And that's, there's a lot of good disciple making principles and all there. But yeah, I could go on, but that's just a brief about who I am and where we're at in our lives right now.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Yeah, you're talking about some serious things here, like transitioning in life. It's funny, even as we're talking about getting to know you, we can't help but think, well, that's part of what disciple making is helping people transition from season to season to season and be faithful in all of those seasons. So even as you're sharing your story, we're continuing to look to Jesus to be faithful father and mother of our daughter, and as she transitions to become an adult, and how do we help her want to love Jesus rather than tell her she has to, So there's all kinds, like you said, all kinds of discipleship and disciple making, parallels really in all of life. So man, it's so true. I didn't realize this, but our social media director, she's a Penn State fan, so she's probably going to wig out on us.
She might delete
pretty
that
hardcore.
Right? Edit that.
Yeah. So, hey, Heidi, we're both Buckeyes fans. You're going to have to deal with it. And then probably when they win, we're going to rub it in. So
That's
we love
right.
you, Heidi, but go Bucks no matter what. That's right,
Yep.
man. So, well, man, we you said you've been doing it for 25 years. I think I met the Navigators in 1999, so about 25 years. I wouldn't say I've been making disciples, but I've been learning about discipleship and disciple making for about the same time, Justin. So many people use the word, use this word discipleship, or what is a disciple? And in your article that we're going to talk today about the 7 effective tests, and we'll link that in our show notes for people to check out. Highly recommend you check out the blog, go to Justin's website, all in the show notes. But you talk about this idea of kind of just trying is a big part of getting started. So how do I make a disciple? So the win is almost in the attempt is the language that you use. But I wonder if it would be helpful for our listeners if you do this in a book that we'll talk about in an upcoming show about kind of defining our terms. What is a disciple? What is discipleship? What is disciple making? So I just wonder from your perspective if you'd really be willing to kind of pull the layers back on that for us and for our listeners about kind of defining our terms before we even jump into how do you make a disciple or what is disciple making?
Yeah, that's super important, John, because if we just throw out language, what I've learned is people will nod their heads and go along. And we're really talking about different things, right? Especially in the area of discipleship and disciple making. We haven't, as a culture, really taken the time to ask the question and to delve down deep into what do these things mean? What do these terms mean? And so, for me, a disciple is someone who follows Jesus in order to become just like Jesus, which speaks to motivation, right? And a lot of the definitions that you'll see out there don't get into kind of the why. Why are we doing this? But someone who follows Jesus in order to become just like him, to me, it takes it back into the context of Jesus's day and time when the rabbi-discipleship relationship was normal. And what's happened so often in our culture is we've ripped it out of that context, and then we've slapped definitions on it or around it that really don't fit. And for some reason, the church as a whole is okay with this. And I was thinking about it recently, like the church would never be okay with that sort of thing with like baptism. We've seen it's not okay with it in marriage, right? That's been something our culture has moved through over the past 20 plus years is how are we define a marriage, all that sort of thing. But we've done it up to this point with discipleship and disciple making. So I've heard as in my work with pastors and church leaders, some of them say, well, yeah, discipleship is anything the church does is discipleship. There's a famous pastor that defines it as a discipleship is doing intentional spiritual good to another. Doing intentional spiritual good to another. I was thinking about that and I thought, well, so does that mean if I pray for someone intentionally, like that's spiritual good to pray for them? Does that mean I could say I've discipled them now? Like that is so far away from what Jesus did with his men. And one of the things that I believe is that Jesus' way of making disciples is the best way. And so I'm trying to get as close to that as I can, right? And so I don't even use discipleship much anymore. I normally prefer the language disciple making. But when I use discipleship, I define it very specifically to anything that's going to help you grow as a disciple minus any missional element. So another way we could say it is discipleship is something that helps me grow in my relationship with Jesus, but doesn't connect to or lead to me helping someone else or me reaching the lost, anything like that. Whereas disciple making, I would say, is more holistic. It is both me becoming more aligned with Jesus and who I am and what I'm doing, but also modeling what he did or following what he did in connecting with the lost and moving it forward into the lives of other believers.
Man, Justin, that's so good. We use the phrase that being a disciple is believing in, belonging to, and becoming like Jesus. And I really felt like you said those things. It's helping me become more and more like Jesus. And the discipleship, I like the distinction there. It's helping people live a life of devotion to Jesus, whereas disciple making is you're being fully invited, and we were asking you to repeat the process like Jesus did for generations to come. Before we hopped on, we talked about, I just had a chance to speak at a conference this past weekend, and I shared the podium with two other gentlemen from two different organizations, and it was just a really life-giving time. But they asked me to talk about what is the vision, so I got to have this fun exercise where I said, hey, when someone says the vision, what does that mean? And there was probably maybe, however many people were there at the conference, we would have had that many definitions of what the vision is really. Well, that's disciples, this is the Bible, or this, what is the vision? It's the kingdom of God. And I just had to start by saying, well, the vision is an ever-increasing focus on Jesus. So that is the vision. We're constantly going back to Jesus as our model. Not our icon, not just a cross that we wear on our chest, but he is our model for ministry. And so, and obviously, we kind of pull the layers on that a little bit. I felt like there's 5 kind of key parts. The gospel, living as a sent person, investing in the few for the sake of the many, knowing that God is empowering all of it by the Holy Spirit, and then lastly, that it's about reaching the world, that for generations and generations and generations to come, that it will be to the ends of the earth and to the ends of the age. And so we kind of pulled that back a little bit, but it's so true. We really do just do a sloppy job, and your point is not lost on me that, wow, we would never accept this kind of like fuzziness about a core doctrine of the church like we're willing to do in disciple making. And it sounds like you've probably experienced that quite a bit.
Yeah, so my role with the Navigators is I work with church leaders. So I work with pastors and elders and everyday church people too. And it's cross-denominational. So I'm getting a broad viewpoint of what is the Western American church? What does it look at? What does it consider discipleship and disciple making? How does it approach it? And so I've just been, convinced that our muddiness and lack of clarity is leading to a lack of effectiveness. And so, I'm trying to help clean that up as best as I can, trying to bring clarity where there isn't clarity, and really challenge and bring kind of that conversation to the forefront so that we can do a better job with it. Because again, it's not just the terminology, it's we don't respect it enough as a church to care about how it's being communicated about. But things like marriage and baptism, we have high respect in the Western church for those things and those concepts, that we would not accept it if somebody was like, oh yeah, I went swimming with my buddy the other day. Yeah, you could say that I baptized him. Like, right. In no way would we accept that.
Oh man, right? Justin, you're hitting people hard here.
Yeah.
This is so good, Justin.
I am regularly in circles where people will say, yeah, I've been just spending time with this person and investing in them. And, we can disciple people without them ever even knowing about it. And I'm like, wait a second. I don't think the scriptures know of any discipleship where the person isn't aware that it's happening, right? Like, so yeah, it's, you can get me going here a little bit, John, but that's something that really bugs me, and I want to see change in the Western church, because if we're going to get serious about disciple making, we need to define it clearly so that we can do it in a clear and intentional way.
Yeah, that's so good, Justin. So we're talking about defining our terms. So often those terms aren't defined. So what happens is, you're in a church and maybe an older gentleman does kind of take you under his wing and really helps you read the Bible, or, you study a book together. Maybe you just had a really great Sunday school with a very conscientious Sunday school leader who's helping you grow. And so, sometimes discipleship just takes on this, well, I'm just going to do what was done for me. And you just kind of repeat that over and over again. And you make this great point that, you do that, but after a while you realize, well, something's not quite right. And then you like, well, maybe we'll change something. And really all that happens is kind of this iterative process of, well, we just added a tiny little bit more of Jesus' DNA, but it's still not complete. Maybe there's another little part of Jesus' DNA we need to add to this, when it's really not this full picture of who Jesus is, the way he did ministry with the 12, with selection and impartation and delegation and being together with them. So I just wonder if you might pull the thread for us a little bit on that concept. Sometimes discipleship really is, I don't know what it is, but I can do what's been done to me. And just kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So let me start by saying, like you stated earlier, the win is in the attempt. Okay, so this conversation is in no way trying to, cast stones at people that are doing it a certain way or not doing it a certain way. Like, if you're disciple making, that's tremendous. Keep going. But we hope
Praise
that,
God.
We hope that you're not just going to be like, well, I don't have anything left to learn about it, right? So my hope, even in myself as a disciple maker, I'm going to be better in 5 years than I am now, right? In 10 years, et cetera, et cetera. I want to keep learning and growing in that. But I notice a pattern that happens in disciple making. And the pattern is this, right? If you're a brand new disciple maker, you don't know where to start. Like, let's say you've never been discipled, but you're in a church or somehow you're around people that are talking about it and they're like, yeah, you should do it. And so normally the first question is, well, what do I do? And then, you might get referred to a book or a curriculum or something like that. And then you just start that. And you start that and you get going with it. And that's what you know to do. And so you do it the first time and then, okay, second time, well, now I'm a little better at it, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of how it goes if you never are discipled but are becoming a disciple maker. Now, for those of us that were discipled or have been or are being discipled, we go in the ways that we've grown. And so the ways that we've grown, the way somebody did with us in disciple making, that's naturally the way that we go as disciple makers. So we say, okay, so-and-so did this with me, I'm going to go do this with them. But as you grow as a disciple maker, then you start to realize some things like, oh, God's really put on my heart and in my life a passion for prayer. And we talked about prayer a little bit, but not nearly enough. And so we need to do more of this. And so you start doing more of that. And some people continue to do that. They'll pass it on, right? And so it iterates through the generations. But the other thing that happens is a lot of times eventually there's somebody that's like, I think I'm going to write this down. Like I'm going to write a book or I'm going to write a curriculum or a Bible study, et cetera, et cetera. And now that gets put out into the world. Mm-hmm. And what we end up with, and this is the current reality in our world, is there are hundreds or thousands of options of books, Bible studies, and curriculum that say or promise this will help you make a disciple. Do this. And so I'm sitting back because one of the common questions I get is, hey, Justin, what should we do to disciple somebody? And what they mean by that question is, what's the book, curriculum, or Bible study do I need to buy in order to disciple the person that I'm trying to disciple?
Right.
Okay, so if that's the question, then there's this many choices. How do we effectively refine the choices and bring them down so there's not thousands, that there might be dozens? How do we do that? And so that's the trail of thought that I was on when I started to develop these ideas that came out as kind of the 7 tests.
Yeah, it's so good. I think I had written down in our notes, sorting through the methods. And it's funny, so the last thing we want, and the first thing that Satan wants, is someone's excited about passing on their faith to the next generation, wants to make disciples. Okay, but they've never been discipled themselves. And then they do a Google search. And like you said, there's 1,000 of these, and it's almost like paralysis, like, well, which one's good? And, well, who's known for discipleship and disciple making? And, oh, does my pastor, the guy I like, my favorite teacher, does he have a book on it? And this is kind of, and then the kind of the fire fades over. Well, there's just not a real clear way to do this then, I guess. And you think, well, it's almost as if people quit because of the options. So I really liked your 7 tests because it puts it back on the ever-increasing focus on Jesus. In fact, that's your very first one, and we can't hold this at bay anymore. We're setting up the stage too well for these 7 tests. So as we think about these 7 tests, your very first one is, if I'm setting out to make a disciple, is it like Jesus? Does the method align with the way that Jesus discipled? And because we talked about this, right? He's not just our icon. He is our model for ministry. And boy, we could go to so many texts in the scriptures that talk about that. But I just think about John 5:39 and 40, where he talks to the Pharisees. It says, you diligently study the scriptures because you think that by them you possess eternal life. These are the scriptures that testify about me. yet you refuse to come to me to have life, and just for them to see who Jesus is. And I think of a passage in 2 Corinthians where I'm afraid that you've been deceived, like Eve, and pulled away from simplicity and purity and devotion to Christ. There's a lot of these passages where we can actually miss Jesus in the scriptures, and he talks about, I've given you an example that you ought to do as I've done to you. And as Jesus says, as the Father sent me, I'm sending you. There's so many of these, like John 20:21. So our very first test there is the like Jesus test. So why is it so hard to help people focus on Jesus-centered disciple making rather than instructional or factual or information disciple making? So from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that's what we've been taught, and that's what we're used to. Right? So for generations in the church, discipleship has been equal to in-depth Bible study and studying the scriptures, but it's been looking at Jesus kind of as a moral teacher, but not as a model, right? So how do we not only look at his teachings, but also look at his methods, what he did and how he did, right? And I think that has to inform what we're doing, right? And so the like Jesus test is really like, hey, does it align with how Jesus discipled? And kind of a shorthand for this, for me, is what's known as the PRISM, and a pastor that I've worked with for a number of years developed this recently. And PRISM's an acronym, right? So is the disciple making personal? Is it reproducible? Is it intentional? Is it sacrificial? Is it missional? Right? Those are some of the shorthand ways of looking at, hey, is this kind of what Jesus did? Because if it's not, if it's promoting something different, well, if you're with me and you believe that Jesus' way is the best way, then that's one of those options out of the thousands that we want to say, yeah, that's not the one I want to pick here.
Yeah, Justin, that's so good. Man, isn't this the cool thing about partnering with people in the kingdom? Someone that you're interacting with, that he's asking you, how do I make a disciple-making culture in our church? And he's giving you this sticky tool to help you focus on what's it look like to kind of assess the Jesus test, right? And so, hey, look, if you're in your car right now and you're trying to write that down, listening to this podcast, check out the blog. It's in the show notes. PRISM, great tool just to be kind of very practically think through those things. It's hard to separate these two tests, 1 and 2, because the like Jesus test is kind of this tool you just gave us. It's personal, reproducible, it's intentional, it's sacrificial, it's missional, but it's also the longer you study how Jesus made disciples, you realize Jesus made disciples by living his life. I'm going to live a life in obedience to the Father. Come watch me. And while you watch me, you're going to learn a whole bunch of things. And lucky for those disciples, Jesus didn't make any mistakes. Anybody we disciple, they get to see all of it, right? All the pluses and the negatives, and they pick up some bad DNA along the way, right? But just this idea of it's meant to be embodied. The gospel message itself is meant to be embodied. At the conference this weekend, we use this idea that no one has questions on how to follow Jesus when they're in church. They don't have questions on how to follow Jesus when they're sitting in a Bible study, or maybe when they're at choir practice. But boy, how do I follow Jesus when I'm a student, I'm at school? Or how do I follow Jesus when I'm at work and my boss isn't a great guy or gal and I'm struggling to love them the way I ought to? And that's this incarnation test, right? The in-between moments of life. We need people to live that out in front of us, and that's what Jesus was. He was a gift to us when he became flesh and dwelt among us. So this incarnation test is a big one. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge, because a lot of the Bible studies and curriculum and books that doesn't talk about it, doesn't require it, right? It requires the person leading it just to know something rather than to be something. And, Jesus, like you said, he was the model, right? Luke 6:40, a student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. So the person discipling is the flesh and blood model. And if we're leaning too heavily on a resource, we aren't that. And we don't need to be that. But we do need to be it if we want to make reproducing disciples. And so that's the part that's so important. And a lot of these tests kind of, it encourages us to think carefully about how we're discipling and whether we're leaning too much on resources like books and curriculum and Bible studies, or whether we're actually incarnating, we're being a disciple maker, and whether we're asking and presenting a picture to those we're discipling as if, yes, this is necessary. You can't just know stuff, right? It's not enough to know stuff or attend stuff. Mm-hmm. We have to become something different.
Yeah, that's so good. And the invitation, right, Justin, is come follow me and I will make you fishers of men.
Yep.
And it's kind of a little bit more clarified in the Mark 3:14.
Yep.
That they were to be with him, kind of watch him live his life. But maybe something that's lost in all of that is that when Jesus invites us to come after him, he invites us to become something.
Yeah.
Right? So he's inviting us to join him in the family business, to join him on mission.
Yep.
And okay, even if I'm inspired by that, how do I do that? And that's usually the missing link for most people. And Jesus said, well, watch me. Just watch me be faithful to the Father. Mm-hmm. And I think if we all think about back to when we were discipled, that was what helped us the most.
Yeah.
Hey, this is how I read the Bible. This is my plan. This is when I get up in the morning and do it. And this is what my prayer list looks like. And this is what happened with my boss today at work. And
yep.
Or, we played a lot of video games when I was growing up in disciple making. We called it revealing sin. Would you like to reveal some sin? Or sports. Like this is something you're doing on a college campus, right. Or over on post, and you're playing sports, and all of your character or lack thereof comes out. It's this: we're living life together, and all of life is addressed, not just this kind of 1 hour snapshot or 2 hour snapshot on an evening Bible study. And that's the Incarnation Test, right? So. Yeah, and things would never come up, right, in conversation across the table, but they would as you do and live life together, right? Yeah, so good. All right, well, you've got number 3 is the consistency test. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so the consistency test is the question of, does the method align with the message, right? So if the message is we need to become something, does the method or what we're using to disciple people, does it communicate that? And I think a lot of times there's a conflict there. There's a mismatch, right? So if I'm coming to someone and I'm saying, yes, I want to help you become a disciple maker. I want to help you grow in your faith. And by the way, we're going to just go through this book together. Well, if that book's not the Bible, it communicates some things implicitly.
Stop, John.
Right?
Sorry. Say that one more time. You got to say that. You got to say that phrase again.
If that book is not the Bible, it communicates some things really clearly and implicitly. Like, it's not explicit, but here's some of the things that it communicates. It communicates that the Bible is not sufficient for us to do this. It communicates that I am not sufficient in my experience and my knowledge of Jesus and my living knowledge. I'm not talking about head knowledge, but my experience with him, the Holy Spirit in me, is not sufficient to disciple you to a place where you are mature. And if I am communicating that with the method that I'm using, then what hope do I have of getting the vision across that they are going to see themselves as one day able to disciple someone else? At best, they might be looking at that resource and thinking, yeah, okay, I think I could learn this book enough where I could do it with someone else. But again, that's not what we're after.
No.
John, I was with a disciple maker. I think I would call him that. You tell me after I tell you the story, but he's in his early 60s, okay? And everyday guy in the church. He's been leading discipleship groups for 10 years. So 3, 4, 5 guys going through a resource that's really well known and really popular that is not the Bible. And he says it's working really well. Guys are doing it with other guys, et cetera, et cetera. And I was encouraging to him, and then I asked him a question. I said, let me just ask you, I said, if I were to tell you that next time you did it, you could not use that resource, what would you do and what would you tell me? And without missing a beat, he said, oh, I couldn't do that. And I was surprised because I thought he could do it, honestly. 10 years through a pretty quality resource, like you kind of should pick up some stuff. And I was like, really, why not? And he said, I wouldn't know what to do. And so what had happened is he's become so dependent upon the resource. He hasn't become equipped. He hasn't really learned how to make disciples. He's just learning how to take people through something. And the message that is coming through underneath that method is, I am not a disciple maker. I cannot out of me help you. Now, the alternative is that we are using tools and equipping that we have through our experience with God and life with God and the scriptures, that I can disciple someone, and I can use that stuff occasionally, but I don't need it. I don't need it. And so when the method and the message don't line up, then it's going to be a lot harder to make multiplying disciples, because our method is communicating something different than our message.
My goodness, this is so good. And that Jesus, the scriptures, and the Holy Spirit, that's the confidence of the disciple maker, right? Our confidence comes from Jesus has given us everything we need for life and godliness. The scriptures are sufficient for the whole of life, and that the Holy Spirit supercharges the whole process, right? But it is overwhelming. You can't help but think, oh man, how am I going to do this? And they got to learn all these lessons. And we used to say, well, what are your top 10 tools, And then we realized, you don't want to say that. We want to say, what are the most important things God's taught you about himself? And do you have sticky ways to give those away to the next generation of people? And they may not even have the same 10 things, but they're going to have ways in which God has changed them, and passages of scriptures that have burned in their hearts that just changes them to the core, and beginning to pass those away. And because what you said is it leads to this fourth test. Without my tool, I don't have it, which is the equipping test. And which is really, does this person on the back end of this thing, can they creatively obey Jesus in multiple contexts and translate it from place to place wherever they go? I'm a big believer in us as disciples making, saying, I don't know. I'm 45 years old. You're 22 years old, and you work in that platoon with those soldiers. I was a soldier 23 years ago. I have no clue what the needs of these people are. What do you think their needs are? Now, I've got some principles, right, or some things that I think God's taught me, but it's this way of saying, well, you've got the Holy Spirit. You're walking with Jesus in this place. You know the needs of the people. Are you becoming equipped to then be able to pass it on? So talk to us about this equipping test, because this one's huge. Because like you said, without tools, many people just kind of crumble.
Yeah, so
talk to us about this.
So this one and the next one come really, really close by out of that consistency test. The equipping test is, are we equipping someone or restricting them? Right? If we're too heavy into a tool or a resource, we're restricting them to that resource, like that guy I just told you about. He is restricted to that. He doesn't know and cannot function outside of that by his own admission. And so really, instead of making a multiplying disciple, we're making a book jockey or a curriculum jockey. And that's not what we're after. And so it's like what you're saying, that are we helping equip them with tools that they have an understanding of how to use them in different contexts, and which contexts they make sense in and which ones they don't. But it also helps them get some vision for, like, oh, okay, so there's things that I need to be equipped with and aim at different situations, so they can see a person's life or the person they're investing in with some nuance and some observational skills of, like, okay, maybe this is the thing for them right now that they need. Not necessarily we have to cover this next thing because it's next thing up in the book, right? And so it's that sort of training process where we're helping them. Again, it's back to that becoming. Are you becoming something, or are you just learning things and hoping that when you throw them out, they hit at the right time?
Yeah, Justin, I just think that this one's a little harder to break through with people, because they can't help but just automatically think, oh, this, then this, then this. Like we think process. We tend to think doctrine and teaching and knowledge. And it's actually much harder to go back and say, Lord, I'm partnering with you with this person. This is where I think they are. Can you show me what needs to come next? Lord, I'm praying to ask for your leading so that I can begin to think through what's next. And what are you doing in their life, and how do I come alongside you? And then how quickly do we introduce this topic of, I want to as quickly as I can, however long that takes, unleash you on the kingdom, go get it, go make disciples. Hopefully you're more gifted and even better at this than I am. Go sick them, basically. And to be able to communicate this idea that, hey, I'll be here. I want to coach and mentor, but really for a season, I want to invest in you deeply so that you can take this on for generations to come. And that doesn't mean we won't have ongoing conversations. We can't grow together. But I think if we kind of front load that idea, that really the outcome is that you are going to become the best version of Jesus that you can be. You're going to be different than me. And you're becoming a disciple maker to your own credit. And boy, I hope that you're better at it than I am, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's the next test,
John.
John. That's the next
Okay,
one, is that
Yep.
outcome test, right? So what exactly are we making? Just like you're saying, any disciple-making resource or way is really a better way to think about it. Any way of making disciples at the end should be making mature disciple makers. Not a copy of you, not somebody who is just equipped to
Thank
do
goodness.
a method, right?
World can only take one of me.
There you go. Yeah. So we want copies of Jesus living in them, right? So Jesus living in me looks one way because of how I've been designed and the experiences that I have and the giftings that he's given me. But Jesus and living in someone else is going to look a little bit different. Now, obviously, there's some similarities, right? Through the Spirit, et cetera, et cetera. But
Right.
if we are just creating copies of me, boy, the kingdom is not going to be well-rounded at all, right? We need to help that person become mature in who they are. And so as I am discipling and trying to understand who God has designed them to be, I'm trying to help fan that flame, right? Fan that flame of maturity so that the expression of them as a disciple maker, John, for me, I am not the most compassionate person in the world. There are many people, it's not a gifting, not a strength of mine. I see it in Jesus. I know I need to grow in it. But when I am discipling someone like that, man, I'm encouraging that. I'm telling them how much I'm challenged by that and learning from them. But when they go out as a disciple maker, they're going to connect to people that I would not naturally connect with. And they're going to be able to disciple them in ways that I never could because of that. And so it's so limiting to the kingdom if I'm only making people that look and act like me, or if I'm only making people that can do just this one resource or this one thing. No, I need to help them come up to the place where they are mature. And the other thing I tell people is that the best disciple-making ideas haven't even been thought of yet.
Yeah,
and so let's make disciple makers that then have the license and the empowerment to think, man, what is God asking me to contribute to this? What are the insights that he's given me around this that I can contribute to all of us in the kingdom so that we can improve as disciple makers as a whole? So again, this outcome test, super important, right? What are we creating? What are we making? What do these people look like as we send them out as multiplying disciples?
Yeah, that's so good, man. So good. All right, we've got two more.
Yep.
And then I want to give you a chance to talk about, I think one of the ways you pull all these ideas, you've written a book, you've pulled all these ideas together in illustration. So I want to give you some time to talk about that.
Yeah.
The like us test. So you asked the question, does it fit us theologically? And can I envision it fitting our context? So can we envision a future in which we're using this method approach in our community? So talk about that a little bit when you're thinking about, you're in Ohio, I'm in North Carolina, I'm in a military setting, you're in a collegiate and kind of a community setting.
Yep.
You were overseas as a missionary, so you kind of live these different contexts. So talk to us about this like us. We would call that our corner of the harvest. Like what principles are true in our corner of the harvest.
Yeah.
Right? So
I like
talk
that
to us
language.
about that.
Yep. Yeah, so it is that, right? So whatever we're doing or however we're trying to make a disciple, does it fit who we are as a community, right? So whoever your tribe is, does it fit you guys? Now, in churches and different denominations, the lines are there and they're maybe a little bit more clear in some places rather than others. But if it's coming from a specific bent or sometimes generationally, I'll be using tools with guys today and they'll be like, I don't like that. And I'll be like, yeah, why don't you like it? And they'll be like, it just feels old. I'll be like, okay, yeah, well, it is old. And so that makes some sense. But
it was old when I learned it, probably, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. But I don't let them get away with it. I just say, okay, well, I don't care if you like that tool. That I really don't care at all. But if you don't like it, then you need to come up with something better. Right? And so come up with something that's going to fit you and fit where you're coming from or where your people are coming from in some cases. And then just give them that license to do that. And so it has to fit you, right? You have to be able to see yourself doing it, to see your people that are in your tribe or your area, corner of the harvest, however you said it, that that they are able to do it and move it forward. Because if it doesn't fit, they're not going to use it and they're not going to move it forward.
Man, that's good, Justin. I can't tell you how many iterations of different tools. And I once heard a story. I don't know if this is like a folklore story or if this is folklore. I can't say that word. We'll just edit that out maybe. I don't know if this is like a folk story or what, but someone once was talking to Dawes, and they asked him about a particular disciple that had fallen away, and he said, well, did you know? And Dawes is like, oh, well, I didn't know, but I thought maybe it might be so. And they said, well, why? And he said, well, he shared the will illustration word for word exactly like I shared it. So Dawes was just kind of saying, well, we're moving into this place where I'm concerned about his own ownership of the principle, but then secondly, him thinking about the audience receiving that message. And there's nothing magical about that particular illustration, though it was life-changing for me when I first saw it. It blew my mind. But instead, the ownership. And I've seen guys turn that thing into a shot picture when you're looking down a rifle, in our military context, or seen different illustrations, or I've seen the gals, female soldiers turn it into a flower, just ways to contextualize and help people see it in a way that's relevant. Maybe that's the wrong word, but in a way that really kind of anchors with them and in their context. So I think this is a really good one. And it forces our people, right? Like I hear you saying, is that it forces them to be trained to think, well, I may not always live in this context, but this principle is always true. So, okay, I can be translating that principle right now, right? Good. I love this last one, and I think that disciple-making cultures and disciple-making ministries can be very guilty of this last test. I don't think we can overdo this one, Justin, is that if people are not coming into the kingdom, if our ministries are not leveraged towards new people coming into the kingdom, we use this phrase generations a lot, where we grew up and in the circles that we run in. And the reality is there's not another generation of Snyders. There's not another generation of Justin Gravitts of your family, you and your wife, unless your children have kids. And that is absolutely true when it comes to making disciples like Jesus. There's not a new generation of disciples without new birth, new people coming into the kingdom. Talk to us about this lost test. I don't think we can overdo this one.
Yep, and I acknowledge this one's a little redundant with the first one, the like Jesus test, but like you said, we have to say it louder and say it more clearly, because in our culture right now, there are a lot of people, even good disciple makers, who aren't being effective among the lost, right? And so they're counting generations being generations of orphans that are being discipled, people that are already in the kingdom. We're helping them grow to maturity, which we need to do, should do. But that cannot be the scope of our vision for disciple making. Again, if we're going to be like Jesus, he said he came to seek and to save the lost. And so that needs to be our orientation, that we are trying to seek and save those who don't yet know him. And if we're doing that, whatever disciple making way that we're practicing, if we're not engaging the lost and helping them come into the kingdom, then something's off there, because that's exactly what Jesus and his men were doing. And so, I put that as the last one, as kind of a way to kind of refocus and say, no, all this other stuff before, super important, but you can look back through all those other lenses, and if it doesn't get to the lost, we're still not where we need to be. And so, the lost test or the saving test, that is certainly central to disciple-making ministry.
Maybe this one goes away with time. I don't think it does, but I think it was very common where we would find folks who had kind of had nominal understanding of who God is and maybe understood the gospel and had accepted Jesus, but wanted to grow. I think that's less and less likely as time goes on, where we're actually discipling the lost into a relationship with Jesus. But it doesn't mean we don't practice selection. We don't pick the healthiest to invest in order to help us find more lost people. But generally what happens is we just keep picking up, like you said, more orphans, folks who knew about Jesus. And let's do that. Let's help people grow and mature regardless, right? It actually makes the job of evangelism easier when Christians actually act like Jesus. So we want them to grow and mature. so their poor witness doesn't affect our evangelism. I don't know if you ever heard that before, but it's kind of like damage control, right? Like, but if we're not leveraging it towards the lost, it doesn't even necessarily mean that I'm doing a whole bunch of evangelism, though I do prefer to do that. It does mean, though, that every disciple that I'm with knows how to do evangelism, is actively engaged in loving the people around them, has a top 10 most wanted list that they're praying for of folks they want to see come into the kingdom that are not yet, and they're growing their heart for the lost. And I just find that as one of the ways that that Jesus always made us look up, always makes us, and made his disciples. The harvest is plentiful, laborers few. The sheep are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Pray, and then he sends them out, right? So, man, I think this 7 test was really good. So you have packaged all of this. It's not necessarily just because of this article, though. This is kind of the wheelhouse that you live in and the ways you think about helping people package and wrestle through principles. Well, you put this all together in a book that you wrote. Is it just called The Bicycle Illustration, before I butcher it? And most people are going to understand kind of the power source. The hub is the typical wheel illustration that we've seen if you've grown up in Navigator circles, or probably in discipleship circles. You've probably seen that. We're going to pull up a picture of this illustration, Justin, but I wonder if you might just talk through. One, it's in the show notes. I think I lost you again. I'll wait for a second. Okay, got me back? Sorry, bro. Yeah, so just so everybody knows, we'll put this illustration, a link to get this illustration directly from Justin's website in the show notes, called The Bicycle Illustration. So we're going to pull this picture up and just let you kind of walk through this picture, and it's kind of going to pull all these pieces together. Look, we're not going to teach you this illustration. We want to kind of whet your appetite for it. If you'd like, you can also hear Justin walk through it on the Practitioner's podcast. He walked through that, I think, in 3 separate episodes where you've taught through this particular illustration. We'll link that in the show notes as well. But just for our folks who may not jump on one of these other websites, kind of just walk through that picture with us a little bit and help us understand kind of these pieces coming together.
So this whole tool came together as a result of just seeing people say over and over and over again, I don't know how to do it, I don't know how to do it, I don't know how to do it. And so actually one of the conferences I spoke at not long ago, they said, would you take one of those messages and just tell us how to make a disciple? I said, okay. Right. And then I actually had to get down and try to figure out how to do that from the stage, right? I'm like, what?
No pressure.
Yeah. And so what I came up with, and I really felt like God gave it to me, was this illustration of a bicycle. And the first part of what I was communicating in both the resource and that conference was, hey, the power is the disciple's wheel. So that's that back wheel, right? It's tied into the pedals. It's where the power comes from in our life. But there's really another wheel, and I call it the Disciple Makers wheel. The center is still Jesus, but it really goes over and over what we need to do in a disciple's life. Right? Teach them what, tell them why, show them how, get them started, keep them going, help them pass it on. So really, we're doing that over and over again with different things in a disciple's life. And then the other parts of the illustration, it talks about kind of how do we invite someone into disciple making, what are the pieces and parts of disciple making, and then it talks about vision and how do we balance that in a disciple making life and relationship. And here's the thing. So I got all the way through that. I actually had a bicycle up, as I was communicating about this, and I can tell people are really tied into it. And then I said, yeah, but here's the thing. You can understand all of that, and you still can tell me you don't know how to make a disciple. Just like I can explain how to ride a bike as clear. You could read every book in the world about how to ride a bike, and you still can't say you know how to ride a bike. And so the thing is, you got to get on and you got to do it. And most people that aren't making disciples, this came out of some Barna research that came out a couple years ago in concert with the Navigators, and it said 22% had never thought about it. So when you ask them, why aren't you making disciples, fellow believer? I just haven't thought about it. 24% say, well, I've never been asked. Nobody's ever asked me or invited me to do it. Okay? But then 37% say they don't know how, they're not equipped or not qualified. And I was just chewing on that, and the Navigators responded to that research, and they came to a conclusion that honestly I didn't agree with. And I'm kind of a contrarian anyway, so it's not that surprising. But they're
I won't tell them, though you went public. I won't tell them. But
that's all right. Yeah. I've talked about it before. But they conclude, well, we need we need to get more resources out into people's hands. And I think, well, that's one way to interpret that data. But another way to interpret it is the resources aren't the answer. I think there's plenty of resources out there. But the reality is, if you never get on the bike and try to ride it, you're never going to become someone that knows how to ride a bike. And so the resource, the bicycle illustration, kind of unpacks all of that, right? It starts with the problem of people aren't doing it. Why aren't they doing it? It talks about how do we do it as best as I know how to communicate it clearly in a succinct way. But then it gets to, but here's the real problem. The real problem is people aren't getting on the bike. And how do we
get on the seat?
Yeah, how do we change that? And that's where the punch of the book really comes, is I think there's ways to move through that. So, yeah, that's a resource that's been out in the world for close to 9 months right now. And yeah, I think it's helping a lot of people, and I'm excited about, other places it'll go. But yeah, it is that picture of what does it look like to make disciple makers, and how do we get people started in it?
Yeah, great, Justin. So if you're like me, freeze your love language. This is a free tool. So you can hop on Justin's website and download that. Right, you could do that today. As soon as you get off this podcast right now, you could log on, grab that tool. Very easy to read. I think it's about maybe 50 pages or so, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yep. Yeah, the digital copy is free. If you want it in print for yourself or maybe people you're working with, those are available too, and they're not expensive. So, yeah, my goal is to get it out and to serve people with it.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Yeah, so, man, we've really kind of been all over the place, but really it's all like kind of what we started with, an ever-increasing focus on Jesus, right? Focusing on Him as our model, really proclaiming Him, proclaiming His message, using His method, and hopefully passing that on to the ends of the age and to the ends of the earth, right? That Jesus would be the name that's on the lips of so many people for generations and generations to come until He comes back, right?
Yeah.
So, Justin, I can't thank you enough for jumping on, but wanted to give you just one last chance. Do you have any final exhortations or encouragements or tools that you'd want to share with us? We're going to tease your book here at the very end.
Okay.
You just finished another book, but any other tools that you would recommend or kind of final charges for our folks?
I would just bring us back to that phrase, the win is in the attempt. And so if you are working as a disciple maker, if you're trying to disciple, keep going and keep working to get better and to improve your skills. And if you're not yet that, just lean in a little bit. Just try it. Know that Jesus is with you in that attempt, and that regardless of how it goes, that's progress if you just step out and try it. So that would be the thing. Also, just an encouragement to you guys into the harvest. Really appreciate the work you guys are doing. And, I'm tracking along with this podcast even before I was invited on. And so I really appreciate what you guys are putting out into the world. And yeah, I just feel like we are of like heart and mind. And so it's always encouraging to see what you guys are up to.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Well, we'll tease it now. So I just got my copy. Can folks actually buy this copy?
It's out September 17th, so it depends when you drop this.
Suckers. I got it first. But so your next book is The Foundation of a Disciple-Making Culture, and the idea of a core team. But from the very, very beginning, you actually just start out by defining the terms like we did today, which was so good. So folks, be looking for this on Amazon, but also we'll talk about it. Justin's going to give me a couple days to let me read through this. And then we'll actually have him back on to talk about just this book and some of the tools and observations that we had kind of walking through it together. So I look forward to doing that with you, Justin.
Absolutely.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to kind of get a sneak peek.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that, and look forward to really, hopefully, the generations of disciples that come as a result of that, who pass it on for generations to come.
Amen.
So, well, Justin, thanks for joining us. It was really an honor. Look forward to having you back on. Hopefully we'll get to do that sometime soon.
Yeah, sounds good. This was fun. Thank you.
Yes, sir.